Your money exists as a permission. That is not a metaphor, it is an architectural fact. Every dollar in a bank account, every balance on a payment platform, every asset held in a brokerage, each one depends on a chain of institutional permissions remaining intact. The institution must remain solvent, the platform must remain operational, the jurisdiction must remain stable, the account must remain in good standing under whatever terms the institution currently enforces. Most people treat those conditions as permanent. They are not, they are contractual, and contracts can be revised, suspended, or terminated. In 2022, Canadian authorities invoked the Emergencies Act and directed financial institutions to freeze accounts associated with individuals who had donated to truckers protesting vaccine mandates. No court order was required, no criminal charge was filed. The mechanism worked because every account involved existed as a permission inside a centralized system. The permission was revoked, access ceased, the funds remained numerically present and functionally inaccessible. That event did not require a collapse. It did not require hyperinflation or systemic failure. It required only that a government decide to use a tool the architecture of digital finance had already made available. The question is not whether that tool will ever be used again. The question is whether your financial architecture assumes it cannot be used against you. Most architectures make that assumption implicitly. They are built for convenience and optimized for access, not for resilience, and not for continuity under adversarial conditions. The vulnerability is structural. The response must be structural as well. Sovereignty is not a single account or a single tool. It is a layered system, each layer performing a distinct function, each layer mitigating a specific failure mode. Each layer introduces a trade-off that must be understood and accepted before it is constructed. The first layer is the monetary reserve. This is the deepest layer of the architecture, the foundation that is not meant to move. Its function is to store value outside the permission infrastructure of the conventional financial system. Bitcoin performs this function architecturally in a way that no other instrument currently matches. Bearer property, self-custodied, resistant to debasement by design, and not subject to institutional counterparty risk when held correctly. The risk this layer mitigates is custodial collapse and monetary debasement. If the institutions holding your assets fail or choose to restrict your access, assets held in this layer are unaffected. The trade-off is real. A hardware wallet that is lost, damaged, or improperly backed up represents permanent loss. There is no recovery service. There is no institutional backstop. The security that makes this layer resistant to external intervention is the same property that makes operational error irreversible. That trade-off is not a reason to avoid the layer. It is a reason to understand it before constructing it. The second layer is the liquidity buffer. A monetary reserve optimized for long-term storage is not optimized for daily expenditure. A sovereign architecture requires a liquidity layer, cash or near-cash instruments, that covers near-term operational needs. This buffer exists so the reserve is never forced to liquidate under pressure. When a black swan event compresses asset markets and creates forced selling dynamics, individuals without a liquidity buffer must sell at the worst possible time or forgo essential expenditure. A liquidity buffer creates optionality. The reserve can remain intact while the operational layer handles short-term demand. The risk this layer mitigates is forced liquidation at adverse prices. The trade-off is purchasing power erosion. Cash held as a liquidity buffer is subject to inflation. This layer is not an investment, it is a buffer. Treating it as an investment introduces risk at the wrong layer of the architecture. The third layer is controlled, asymmetric exposure. A sovereign framework can include a defined, bounded allocation to higher volatility instruments, structured with position sizing that allows the architecture to survive total loss of that layer. Total loss of this layer must not compromise the reserve or the liquidity buffer. That sequencing is not optional. The function of this layer is to preserve optionality toward capital appreciation without concentrating that risk in the foundation. Position sizing is not a preference here, it is a structural constraint. The structural discipline is sizing this layer so that maximum loss does not propagate upward into the layers above it. The fourth layer is the privacy and operational security layer. Information about your financial architecture is itself an asset and a liability if mismanaged. Who knows what you hold, where you hold it, and what infrastructure you depend on determines who can target you. Operational security in this context means minimizing the attack surface of your financial information, limiting disclosure, compartmentalizing infrastructure, maintaining awareness of jurisdictional exposure. Digital footprints associated with financial activity are persistent and often irreversible. The trade-off is friction. Operational security introduces inconvenience. Compartmentalization requires deliberate maintenance. The cost of that friction is real. The cost of not paying it is potentially higher. Framework design and behavioral execution are different problems. A well-designed architecture can be destroyed by poor execution. The failure mode is rarely technical. It is behavioral, the decisions made under pressure, under excitement, or under a false sense of security. The first discipline principle is position sizing under volatility. The common mistake is sizing positions based on expected upside, treating allocation as a function of conviction rather than a function of loss tolerance. Conviction does not determine what you can survive losing. The structural correction is to size every position in every layer from the maximum loss scenario backward. What happens to the architecture if this position goes to zero? If the architecture remains functional, the position size is defensible. If it does not, the position is oversized, regardless of conviction level. The second discipline principle is counterparty accumulation avoidance. The common mistake is treating diversification across multiple custodians as equivalent to reducing custody risk. Holding assets on 5 different exchanges is not self-custody. It is custody risk distributed across 5 separate counterparties, each carrying its own solvency risk and operational continuity uncertainty. The collapse of FTX in November 2022 demonstrated that assets on a custodied platform are not your assets. They are the platform's liabilities to you. When the platform fails, that distinction matters. The structural correction is to distinguish between counterparty diversification and actual custody independence. Only assets held under your direct control, with keys you possess, exist outside the counterparty risk structure. The third discipline principle is information hygiene under stability conditions. The common mistake is treating security practices as crisis responses, things you implement when you feel threatened. This creates a reactive posture where the security infrastructure is built after the exposure has already occurred. Operational security measures applied during a crisis are often incomplete, rushed, and traceable. The structural correction is to treat security posture as a baseline condition, not a contingency response. What you do not disclose under normal conditions does not need to be protected under adversarial ones. Discipline and structure are not guarantees, they are probability adjustments. The goal of a sovereign architecture is not to eliminate risk, it is to remain functional when risk materializes. That requires understanding not just what can go wrong, but what the failure mode looks like structurally and what the architecture must absorb. The first failure scenario is exchange and custodial collapse. This failure mode has occurred with documented regularity. MT, GOX in 2014, Quadriga CX in 2019, Celsius, Voyager, and FTX in 2022. In each case, assets held under custodial arrangements became inaccessible or unrecoverable when the institution failed. In each case, users discovered the distinction between held assets and platform credits. The structural safeguard is unambiguous. Assets whose private keys you do not control are subject to the solvency and operational continuity of whoever holds those keys. There is no yield rate, no interface convenience, and no institutional brand that changes this structural fact. The second failure scenario is jurisdictional and regulatory shift. Regulatory environments are not static. What is legally permissible to hold, transact, or transfer in a given jurisdiction can change through legislation, executive action, or regulatory reinterpretation, sometimes with limited lead time. Jurisdictional exposure is a structural risk for anyone whose entire financial architecture operates within a single regulatory environment. The structural safeguard is jurisdictional awareness, understanding where your assets, your legal identity, and your operational infrastructure are concentrated, and whether that concentration creates a single point of failure under adverse conditions. This does not require immediate geographic relocation. It requires knowing what the concentration is before it becomes a constraint. Resilience is a function of how many single points of failure exist in your architecture. Each dependency that cannot fail independently, without cascading into the rest of the system, is a structural liability. The work of sovereignty construction is identifying and reducing those dependencies, not eliminating all risk, but ensuring that no single event can terminate your financial continuity. Sovereignty is not an event you complete, it is a condition you maintain. The architecture described here is not a product and not a path to wealth. It is a framework for remaining operational financially, digitally, and structurally. Across conditions you cannot predict and may not be able to influence. The goal is not to escape the system. The goal is to reduce your dependence on any single node within it failing gracefully for your benefit. That reduction is incremental. It is built layer by layer under discipline, without urgency and without shortcuts. The reserve layer is built first because it is the foundation. The liquidity layer is sized before the asymmetric layer is opened because the sequencing matters. The privacy layer is established as a baseline because retrofitting it under pressure is less effective and more expensive. None of this is free. Every layer introduces trade-offs. Operational security introduces friction. Self-custody introduces irreversible operational risk. Jurisdictional awareness introduces complexity. These are not arguments against building the architecture. They are the conditions under which the architecture must be built honestly. The measure of a sovereign structure is not how it performs during normal market conditions. It is how it performs when a permission is revoked, when an institution fails, when a regulatory environment shifts without warning. A structure optimized exclusively for good conditions is not a sovereign structure. It is a convenience arrangement that functions until it does not. Build for the conditions you hope never arrive. That is what discipline looks like in practice. This is 21 Protocol. Freedom is not a feeling, it's a structure. If you don't build your